I have no idea. This is my third time in the building. Thank you. All right, here. All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Hot. It's really hot. It's really freaking hot outside. Yeah, that adds to the heat. But yeah, I've only stepped outside of my office for about 10 minutes today, which was just a walk from my office to here. But even that, I'm like, this is too hot. This is too much, man. My plants are dying at home, so I have to I gave them so much water today, so hopefully they're okay. So today for lecture we're going to be talking about bones. So kind of another kind of a biology kind of type lecture today. And so, there's no calculation today. It's just kind of just explanations. I thought I'd change it up instead of slides. I have this is kind of how I usually lecture with an iPad here. I stream it on Canvas, I stream it on Zoom. So those of you on Zoom can view it as well. And of course, it's recorded on YouTube for you to view later as well. But this is how I typically lecture. It's a little bit easier on my voice because, I can speak and write and then speak and write. So, I'm not just speaking at 1,000,000 miles an hour for 15 minutes. Okay, announcements. Homework 1 was posted. I think probably, most of you probably saw that last Friday. It's due a week from today, so it's going to be due on Wednesday, September 11th, right? So it's all conceptual questions, so we haven't done any kind of problem solving or any calculations just yet. It's basically just, read through the lecture notes, or watch the lectures or read through your own notes and just answer the questions. Some of them are labeling, some of them are just, short answered, but it's all just conceptual questions. Okay. All right. Any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay. All right. So let's go and get started. And so today we're talking about the biomechanics of bones. Okay. So over the course of the next 3 lectures, so this week and next week, we're going to be talking about some of the most important tissues in the body, right? Because to kind of understand our biological system here, it's important to understand the properties of what we're working with. And so, there are 3 kind of topics here. So today we're talking about bones. Monday, we're going to talk about muscles. And then next Wednesday, we'll talk about joints. Okay, so bones, muscles, and joints are kind of the main things that we're going to be focusing on, before we start getting into, some of the calculations that we're going to do. Okay. All right, so let's talk about bones. So bones, I think everyone is aware of kind of what bones are in their body. Bones are kind of they kind of form the what I call the rigid framework that's needed for the human body. Okay. And through this rigid framework, bones are able to give the body its structure, right? Because without bones, bones are probably the hardest, tissue that we have in our body. It'd be a lot more difficult to move just because we don't have any kind of rigid structures to kind of latch onto. Okay. So I think that's what kind of people associate with bones, that they provide strength, they provide structure, they provide a framework, and all that is true. Okay? But bones, actually provide another actually really important purpose with respect to human movement. And so the other kind of purpose that they serve is that they give a place for muscles and for ligaments and for tendons to latch onto. Because we'll see on Monday when we talk about muscles. Muscles are a very fascinating tissue in that they're able to generate so much. Just the fact that they're even able to generate force on their own is kind of miraculous. But without the bones in place, those forces are not going to be able to do anything, right? Because we know from Newton's third law that whenever you produce a force, there's always an equal and opposite reaction force. And so the muscle needs something to attach to in order to actually produce movement. Otherwise, they're just kind of useless on their own, right? So that's kind of why bones are important. And so, they provide strength. They're kind of like the supporting columns or the supporting beams of your body, but also they're important for, causing movement as well, or not causing movement, but they're responsible for, allowing the muscles to generate movement. Okay. Okay. And so to perform these duties, bones have to have certain characteristics. Okay. And so if you think about it with from the framework of like an engineering system, any kind of complex engineering system, if you look at each of the components, each component has a specific role that they need to fulfill. And based on that role, those parts or those components have certain characteristics. And so if you think of the human body as kind of just another engineering system, each component or each tissue or each part of the human body, each has their own role to play. And so they all need their own characteristics. And so probably the most important characteristic for bones to have is that they need to be strong. Okay. Right. One of the responsibilities for your bones in providing your rigid framework is that they also have to provide a lot of load bearing, right? So they have to carry the weight of your body, especially all the bones in your lower body. And so to do that, they need to be strong. And since they're always being pulled in different directions from the muscles, oftentimes in opposite directions, they need strength in order to do that as well. Okay. Um, so they need to be strong. Two, they also, as a person grows, their bones also grow as well. So bones actually really need the ability to, first of all, grow and become bigger and become stronger. But in many situations, our bones also need to be able to regenerate itself as well. I think you hear all the time of athletes getting fractures, or your uncle getting a fracture, or things like that, right? And even something that doesn't rise to the level of like a fracture or a crack, there's always a lot of little micro injuries that occur in your bones as well. And so bones actually need to have the ability to grow and regenerate. Okay. And that's something that we don't often think about with bones, because by being kind of the backbone and the strength and kind of how hard that they are, oftentimes we think bones are often thought of as kind of passive structures in your body. But nothing could be further from the truth. Your bones are as much living tissue in your body as your muscles, as your organs, as your brain, and such that they're able to kind of regenerate and grow just like any other tissue in your body. Okay. All right. And so we'll talk about both these things. And so we'll talk about kind of what makes bones so strong. What we'll talk about its material composition, and we'll spend the majority of the latter half of the class talking about how bones are able to grow and how bones are able to regenerate. Okay. And so because bones play such an important role in the body, maintenance of bone health is something that's critically important for basically every living person in the world. The unfortunate thing about bone health is that, if you ever get a condition, or if you ever get an injury where, where you can feel your bone health deteriorating, usually at that point it's too late. And so, bone health is like one of those things in your body where it's not something that you can fix, in an afternoon, or you can't fix it, acutely with medicine. Your bone health is really kind of the accumulation of all of your lifestyle habits, all of your lifestyle diets, And by the time you kind of realize something is wrong, it's kind of too late. And so, it's probably kind of hammered into you guys, from the school health office to commercials and all that stuff about how important it is to exercise regularly, eat well, make sure you get enough calcium in your body. That's all actually extremely important to do when you're young, because when you're older, it's actually much harder to actually do those things and fix these issues. Okay? We'll talk about that kind of at the end of class. Okay. All right, but that's just an introduction. And so, this kind of provides kind of the outline of kind of what we're going to go over today. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the material composition and the structure of bone tissue. Okay, so like I mentioned before, it's really important for bones to be strong, and so its material composition reflects this. Okay? And so if you look at the material composition of bones, it's really made up of three main materials. It's a complex material. It's not something that's uniform. Like it's not just a uniform aluminum or anything like that. It's really kind of a composite of multiple things. Okay. So the first one, I think the one that people always associate with bones is calcium. Right. I don't know if they still run them on TV, but during my Saturday morning cartoons growing up, they always had the milk commercials and always telling you that calcium is needed for strong bones. So they weren't lying. That wasn't fake news or anything. So calcium is the main kind of building block for bones. Okay. The second material that you may have heard in like Neutrogena commercials is collagen. Collagen is a very important material, for just your entire body in general, not just your bones. It makes up your muscles, also the inner linings of your organs, your skin, of course, your hair. Collagen is a very important material. And number three might be the surprising one, but another really important material in bones is water. All right, so let's talk about each of these and kind of talk about kind of the role that they play, or kind of what they contribute to the material properties of bone. Okay. All right, so calcium. Calcium makes up the majority of the composition of bone. So and it varies from bone to bone, but for the most part, 60 to 70% of the dry weight of bone is made up of calcium. Okay. So like I mentioned, calcium is where bones derive most of their strength. So that was pretty straightforward. Okay. Oh, I should be a bit more clear. So calcium gives strength, but it's a very special kind of strength. And I kind of missed that in my notes. But so the type of strength that calcium contributes is compressive strength. And that's actually really important. So we'll talk about it, a bit later in class today. But bones are actually what's called an anisotropic material. So that means that its strength or its perceived strength is different depending on how you load it. Okay. Bones are such that, you know, they're strongest in compression, just because that's kind of what they're mostly, you know, that's their most used case, is that, you know, your bones are going to be compressed, either by the weight of your body or through the actions of muscles. And so it's really important for them to have a lot of compressive strength. Okay. All right, number 2, collagen. Okay. So if you've ever seen collagen, or if you've ever kind of heard of it, collagen is this kind of, you know, very elastic, kind of stretchy, almost kind of like rubbery type of material, right? So collagen, it's not a major constituent of bones, but it is there. And what collagen does is it actually provides the bones a little bit of flexibility. That's actually really important. So it's actually really important for your bones to have a little bit of give. It can't be just a very kind of, you know, if your bones were completely stiff and completely, you know, rigid and brittle, you know, actually people get injured quite a lot. And so, you know, it is actually important for bones to have some kind of, you know, flexibility, that it can kind of deform, elastically deform, and still kind of be okay, especially kind of at the ends of bones. Okay. And collagen also contributes a little bit to tensile strength. It's not common, you know, just based on the way that the bones are arranged in your body and the way it interacts with your muscles. But there are some cases where, you know, your bones are going to, you know, go under tension as well, mostly from bending. And so it's important to have some strength in the tensile direction as well. So collagen kind of provides that property for your bones. All right, and the number 3 is water. And so water at any given time makes up about 25 to 30% of the bone weight. It contributes a little bit to the strength. Okay. But the main role that water plays in your bones is that it allows for the transport of nutrients and transport of you know, of cells, of things inside your bones. Okay. And so, you know, contrary to what you might think, you know, your bones actually have a lot of blood vessels running through them. You know, otherwise, you know, your bones wouldn't have the ability to regenerate or grow, right? It needs to be connected to your cardiovascular system in a way in order to get access to these things. And so a lot of the water weight that's in bones actually comes from the blood vessels, right? But water is also used as a means of, you know, of kind of transporting other goods. And it kind of, you know, links a lot of the collagen and calcium kind of together. And so it kind of helps. It's you can kind of almost think of it like the glue that kind of holds kind of everything together in the bones. Okay. Um, and the water actually plays a really important role, because without water, your bones actually exhibit very different material properties. Right. Because without the bones, you know, the collagen kind of isn't really able to do its thing, and the calcium kind of gets kind of stuck and kind of dry and kind of brittle. So, you know, the without water, you know, your bones actually get a lot weaker. And so that's actually really challenging. It's actually been really challenging for scientists, because, you know, if you want to study the material properties of a certain material, the best way to do it is just to simply test it. But if you're trying to get bone samples from a cadaver or from something like that, one thing that happens after a person dies is that their cardiovascular system just kind of stops, and all the blood kind of coagulates and doesn't flow anymore. So the water kind of very quickly kind of depletes from the bones. And so what scientists have found is that studying bones from cadavers or from bones that have lost the majority of their water really isn't effective, or it really isn't accurate, because bones exhibit very different material properties when they're kind of hydrated versus when they're not. All right, any questions on this? Yeah.
Does this bone makeup of like the calcium, collagen, and water go across most mammals or living beings with bones?
Yeah, it's a good question. The exact ratio, I think this composition, these materials are pretty much in most living beings with bones. Just the exact ratio is going to be different depending on the animal, because it's some animals will have larger weight bearing responsibilities than others, and so on and so forth. Mhm. Any other questions on this? Yeah.
So I noticed that bones inside the bone marrow.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
what is that? Is that mostly blood vessels and cardiovascular?
Yeah. Yeah, no, bone marrow is very fascinating. A lot of it is kind of the blood vessels, because bone marrow is kind of inside the bone. We'll talk a bit later that the bone is kind of a very hard kind of shell, and then inside is kind of more kind of spongy and soft. So the inside is like, that's where you see a lot of the water, a lot of the collagen is there, a lot of the blood vessels. So it's kind of a mix of kind of all of those things. Yeah. Mhm. Cool. All right, so on that note, let's talk about another really important property of bone structure, which is porosity. So bones are not it's not I would say, a uniform kind of material. And so if you kind of look at a cross section of a bone, you'll see that there are kind of lots of really, really tiny holes in it. Okay. And so if you actually look at it under a microscope, it almost kind of looks like a sponge. And so if you look at kind of a sponge that you use to clean your dishes, it has all these kind of really tiny holes for kind of water to go through. Bones are kind of the same thing. So you have all these kind of little tiny pores. And so, the purpose of the pores, the main purpose is to provide kind of a means for blood vessels kind of, go through your bones. Right? So that's how, oxygen, nutrients are delivered to the bone. It's through the blood vessels that go through the pores. Okay. But of course, having a bunch of little tiny holes in your structure is going to affect its material properties as well, right? And so the exact ratio of pores versus solid structure is actually a really important property for bones as well. Okay. And so that ratio, often we express that ratio as a percentage. That's what we define as the porosity. Okay. And so based on this definition of porosity, we can kind of describe two different types of bones. Okay, so the first type of bone is called cortical bone. Okay. So cortical bone is kind of the name that we give to bones that have relatively low porosity. So these are almost, for the most part, almost completely just solid material, solid structure. Okay. So cortical bone is kind of defined somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 30% porosity. Okay. And because it has such low porosity, it has, high mineral content instead, high amounts of, calcium, collagen, that stuff. Right? Right. And so cortical bone is your kind of your high strength bones. That's where most of the strength of your bones comes into play. All right. So the second type of bone that's defined by the porosity is known as trabecular bone. And so in contrast to cortical bone, trabecular bone have high porosity. So high porosity is defined usually anywhere between 30% and 90%. Okay. And so way more so than cortical bones, trabecular bones kind of, it kind of has the informal name as spongy bone. Okay. Because if you look at it, it kind of looks like a sponge. Okay. And so, of course, because it has, relatively low mineral content compared to cortical bones, it's going to have less strength. And so it's not going to be able to withstand, as high a magnitude of forces. But unlike cortical bone, it is a lot more flexible. And so it's able to kind of deform elastically without kind of catastrophically fracturing. Okay. Right. So these are the two types of, or at least the way that we can classify bones based on porosity. Okay. And so you might be asking, what bones are typically cortical bones and what bones are typically trabecular bones? And so this distinction here is not really, it's not a characteristic of individual bones in the body, because it turns out that most bones actually have certain sections that are cortical and certain sections that are trabecular. Okay. And so when I say cortical bone or trabecular bone, it's not referring to an entire bone structure. It's referring to the type of bone tissue. Okay. So let me give you an example. A very typical kind of long bone in the body. Right. So the long bones are the bones that comprise your limbs, and so this could be one of the bones in your leg or your arm. So long bones kind of have a structure. It's kind of like this. We'll say this is the tibia, just for you know, example's sake. Okay. And so what's interesting about this bone, long bones are kind of a great example because it kind of shows you kind of a lot of different aspects of bones and kind of what they are used for. Okay. And so we have the kind of the long kind of middle part here. Okay. And so kind of the long middle part of the bone here, this is what's often, you know, stressed when you when you apply forces to the bones, right? And so what happens often is that this bone may be exposed to some compressive forces, right? So maybe some reaction force from the ground, or maybe it's being pulled on by muscles, right? And when you compress something, you know, most of the stress or most of the the strength is going to be needed in the middle, okay? And so you're going to have stress concentrations in the middle, kind of in the middle of the bone, okay? And a lot of times, you know, it's not just a purely compressive force. You know, you may have some kind of, you know, oblique forces that come this way, right? So it's not just compression, but there's also kind of bending that can occur in the bone as well. And by bending, you know, most of that bending stress is going to be kind of concentrated in the middle, okay? And so for that reason, you know, the middle sections of these long bones need to have high strength. And so typically what you're going to see is that the bone tissue kind of in the middle of bones is going to be made primarily of cortical bone, because that's where most of the strength is needed. Okay. All right, and so now let's look at the ends of the bones. Okay. And so if you look at how I drew this bone, you'll see that I kind of drew the ends a little bit wider than the middle, right? And that's pretty typical of a lot of the bones in your body as well, right? And so that serves kind of two purposes. And so on the one hand, you know, the ends of your bones are wider just for the fact that, you know, a lot of ligaments and a lot of tendons and a lot of, you know, attachments happen at the end of bones. Okay. Right. And so what you're going to see is that, you know, the way your muscles attach to your bones is that your muscles attach to a tendon, and then the tendon attaches to your bone, right? And oftentimes, you know, your bones have multiple muscles kind of attached to it. And so just to give those muscles more surface area to attach to, you know, the ends of bones just have to be wide for that reason. Okay. Tendons and ligaments and so on and so forth. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but tendons are connective tissue in your body that connects your muscles to the bones, whereas ligaments are connective tissue that connects bone to bone. Okay? And for the most part, those attach at the ends. Okay? But another reason why the ends of your bones are kind of wider is that the ends of your bones are often coming under a lot of impact forces. Right? Because if you think about kind of the stress or kind of the force that your bones kind of experience throughout the day, it's not a constant force, right? So you can think of times where even just walking, right? And so when you step down, you know, that's going to provide a lot of force. But then when your foot comes up, that a lot of that force is alleviated. So, you know, in addition to kind of a lot of, you know, magnitudes of force, but the types of forces that your bones experience is kind of abrupt in nature. And so the thing with impact forces is that, you know, when you have a big impact force and you kind of want to lessen its impact, I guess, you know, what's something that we're always taught, at least from starting from physics, right? You need to have some kind of give, because kind of the longer that you expose that contact time, the less magnitude of force that you experience. Okay? And so to kind of help with that, first of all, the ends of your bones here are of higher surface area, so that force is kind of distributed across a higher, amount of area. But also internally, what you see here is that your ends of bones have a lot more pores than the inside. And so what you see in typical bones is that the ends of bones, the ones that articulate with other bones in your body, with the ligaments and the tendons, those are much more likely to be trabecular bone. Because they're mainly responsible for kind of softening a lot of the impacts that your bones undergo throughout the day. All right, so you can see, from this example here that, most bones have a combination of cortical bone and trabecular bone, depending on kind of where it's located and kind of what its main function is. Okay. All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's talk very briefly. So kind of while we're on the subject of kind of material strength, let's talk briefly about the elastic properties of bones. And so in this section here, we're going to compare, at least how we quantify, how we measure the elastic properties of bones relative to, a typical engineering material like aluminum and so forth. Okay. Okay. So right off the bat, bone does not really behave like a typical, material that we're used to. Bone is what's characterized as an anisotropic material. And so what that basically means is that the strength and the properties of the bone depend on which direction that the bone is going to be loaded in. Okay. So we've kind of already hinted at this a bit. We already have kind of established that bones are much stronger in compression than tension. But one thing that's actually really important is that bones are very weak to shearing stresses. Okay. So basically, any kind of force or any kind of load that attempts to kind of shear a bone apart, it's probably going to be successful because bones are very weak to shearing. Okay, that's why a lot of those gruesome kind of injuries that you see that people receive when they get bone injuries are ones where they're either someone's leg or someone's arm gets kind of caught in a machine, and that machine often will apply some kind of shearing stress to the bones, right? And so you have to be really, really careful about this. If you're either working with kind of heavy machinery or you're designing something work, for people to work with heavy machinery, just kind of be aware that, if you apply shearing stress to the bone and you apply enough force, it's going to cause, fractures or, in the worst case, completely broken bone. Okay. All right. So I don't want to get too much into this just because, we can go very, very deep into the material, characterize the material properties of bones. But, honestly, there's still kind of a lot of work to be done here. Bones aren't like a metal where you can kind of look up online or look up into a material handbook and look up just its Young's modulus right away, right? For being an anisotropic material, you need a lot more parameters to actually fully characterize bone, right? And kind of where the state that we're at right now is that, scientists can't even agree on kind of what's a good model to actually, describe the material properties of bones. Okay. And so without a material model, we can't even begin to really describe kind of the parameters of bones. Okay. People have tried, and so it's not that no one has tried this before. Of course, people have tried to do this. It's just getting people to kind of agree and find consensus on something. It's kind of very difficult, right? Part of the challenge is, kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that it's really hard. It's really hard just to get good samples of bones that have the same properties of, when it's inside a live person, right? Bones tend to dehydrate very quickly if they're not attached to a living person. And so getting good samples for, testing is difficult, right? And probably you guys have already experienced this in your labs too, that, even for a material that we know a lot about, like a metal, like aluminum or steel, there's a lot of testing, a lot of very sophisticated testing that needs to be done in order to, quantify things like its Young's modulus or its Poisson's ratio. So, there's still a lot of challenges out there right now for kind of really kind of describing the properties of bones. You'll be able to find papers where people kind of attempt to do this, but usually they're kind of in very kind of niche, kind of very kind of specialized scenarios. And so, all this is just to say that it's, this is very much kind of an ongoing topic of research. And a lot of groups are kind of looking at this because, obviously there's a lot of interest in developing this. And so kind of where we are right now as a field is that, we know kind of the general properties of bones where, we know bones are just much stronger in compression than tension. But there's still a lot of work to be done to actually kind of really kind of quantify this. Some people are doing really crazy things of, shooting lasers through bones and using the deflections of lasers to like find out the material properties of bones. So yeah, people are trying a lot of really crazy stuff, but it's still very much kind of a work in progress. Okay. All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's move on. So let's talk about growth and development of bones. Okay. So, just like any other tissue in the body, bones will grow and develop along with the person. Okay. In fact, having your bones grow is probably the most noticeable kind of growth that person can undergo, right? If you kind of think back to, when you were little, at some point, you probably hit a growth spurt, and then everyone's like, wow, you're so tall. That never happened to me. I never really grew past my how tall I was when I was 13, but I like to live vicariously through people, so. All right. And so the direction of growth that bones undergo is usually kind of in two directions. right? And so the most noticeable kind of type of growth is longitudinal growth. Right? And so that just means that the bones kind of get longer, right? Growth occurs in the longitudinal direction. Sorry about that. Right. And the other way that bones grow is they get wider, right? And so we call that circumferential growth. So let's talk about longitudinal growth first. And so the way longitudinal growth works is that, new bone is kind of added in kind of layers in your bone, right? So when your bone needs to grow in length, kind of a new layer of calcium or a new layer of bone material gets added towards the end. So there's a section of most of the long bones in your body called the epiphyseal plate. Listen. So at the epiphyseal plate, typically new bone cells are created, and they're kind of added to the bone at this part. Okay? And so it doesn't always occur in this place, but this illustration just to kind of show you, right? And so if we kind of have a typical long bone, there'll be a plate, not as stark as this, so it's not a stripe, per se, it's kind of a bit more wide and a bit more not as not as sharp, I guess you can say, right? It's a bit more distributed, I guess. But it's something like that, right? And so as you grow, all the blood vessels kind of converge on this plate, and then new bone cells are kind of added, almost kind of you can almost think of it like a 3D printer. And so, a new layer of cells kind of gets printed like this. And then once a new layer gets printed, your entire bone kind of lengthens in kind of that direction. Okay? And of course, this is a very slow process. It's not something that occurs, within a process of minute, within the time frame of minutes. But as you kind of live your life, you sleep and things like that, then new bones get added and you get taller. So most of the longitudinal growth kind of occurs in a certain time frame in a person's life. Right? And that kind of correlates to when the epiphyseal plate is most active in a person's body. So for most people, the epiphyseal plate is most active in adolescence, which is their teenage years into their early 20s usually. Okay. So typically between the ages of 13 and 24, this is where you're going to see, this epiphyseal plate be most active. And that's typically when people kind of hit their growth spurts, right? So that all kind of lines up. So outside of that time frame, it is technically still possible. It's not like your epiphyseal plate just kind of stops working. It is still possible. It's just once you kind of get past that age, most of the growth and most of the development of bones is mostly made to kind of replace any kind of old or broken bones. Okay. And so what we say is that, once you kind of get to later in life, all the new bone cells that are created is mostly for maintenance. So you're not really growing anymore at that point. Okay. All right. And so circumferential growth kind of occurs in relatively the same way. But the purpose of circumferential growth is a little bit different. And so, the reason your bones kind of get wider, and actually you see kind of the most dramatic kind of circumferential growth, mostly in your lower body, is because, as you get older and as you get bigger, you get, heavier, there's more weight that these bones have to support. And so as the weight bearing responsibilities of your lower body or your lower extremity, gets higher, then your bones, naturally will grow wider to kind of support that. Okay? Because the wider your bones are, the more strength that they have, basically. All right, any questions on this? Okay. So another phenomenon, kind of on the subject of growth, typically as people get older, a lot of the collagen in your bones kind of starts to kind of wither away and they're not as active as before. Okay? And it's not just in your bones, but a lot of the collagen and just all the other parts of your body tend to kind of wither away and kind of deplete. Okay. But for bones, the main kind of consequence to your collagen kind of depleting is that your bones become a lot more brittle. And so they lose a lot of the flexibility and the elasticity that they kind of had in your younger years, right? That's why you typically see that, fractures and kind of, especially stress fractures are a lot more common in older people, just because they have a lot less flexibility. And so, it takes a lot less to get a fracture in an older person typically. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's talk about remodeling a little bit. So let's talk about how bones respond to stress. Okay. All right. So like most parts of your body, your bones are comprised of living cells, living things, right? It's not just a passive structure. And so just by that very nature, your bones can actually respond to the mechanical environment that it's placed in. And so if they get, if they're exposed to forces, if they're exposed to stress, they can actually respond to it, right? Which is kind of really, really cool, right? It's not something that it's kind of fixed. And so because of this, bones can actually dynamically kind of what we say remodel themselves based on kind of the stresses and kind of the forces that it experiences. And the typical response, and so if your bones experience force or experience stress, its typical response is that, it needs to get stronger. Right, so this makes sense, right? And so if just like we design an engineering structure, right? If we know a certain part or a certain component is going to be exposed to high forces, then we're going to design it to be stronger in order to withstand it, right? Your body is very much the same way. Okay? So how does this occur, right? So when you expose your bones to high amounts of stresses, it kind of damages some of the bone cells within the body. And so in response, your body will then take those damaged bone cells and almost kind of dismantle them or kind of take it apart through a process called resorption. Okay? Right? So then your body then takes those materials. So they basically kind of take the raw materials, the raw calcium, the raw collagen, and they use that to construct, kind of stronger bones to replace it. So this process of kind of, reabsorbing kind of the weaker kind of damaged bone cells and replacing them with new ones, this is known as bone remodeling. Okay? Remodeling is actually a very interesting phenomenon, and it's not something that's unique to bones. Remodeling is something that occurs in kind of all parts of your body, right? So it's kind of the process that your body goes through to kind of repair, a lot of the cells, a lot of the parts of it. Okay? But since we're talking about bones, we're strictly talking about bone remodeling. Okay? So bone remodeling, it's a process that your body goes through just naturally, but kind of the more stress or the more forces that you expose your bones to kind of encourages this process to occur more frequently and at a higher rate. And this is actually something that you want to trigger. So bone remodeling is actually a very healthy process. And so it's something that you want to kind of go through to kind of make sure your bones are maintained, make sure they kind of, maintain their strength and through all kind of phases of your life. And so what's the best way to kind of expose your bones to stresses, expose them to forces? Well, the best way is just regular physical exercise. Okay. If you want to talk about kind of the most effective exercises for bone remodeling, anything that's high intensity, anything that's going to cause, large amounts of forces on your bones in kind of a short period of time, those are the ones that actually, lead to more growth and remodel. So things like weight training, things like, high impact sports, stuff like that. These are all kind of great ways to kind of maintain your bone health. Okay. All right. And so what happens, when you don't exercise regularly? What happens when you don't trigger remodeling on a regular basis? Okay. And so if your bones aren't exposed to stresses on a regular basis, then your bones will start to think that, hey, we don't really need all this strength. And so they'll start to actually absorb bone tissue without actively replacing it. Okay. So that's why, exercising regularly, making sure you're working out on a regular basis is really important for your bone health. Okay. And that's something that we don't really think about. When people tell you to exercise regularly, usually when people tell you to exercise regularly or you think about exercising, people think about kind of maintaining your body weight, maintaining your image, but it's actually really important for your bone health as well, because you want to make sure your bones are exposed to these stresses and you're triggering this remodeling to make sure your bones are kind of in healthy state. Okay. Okay. But even without exercise, even if you live a relatively sedentary lifestyle, you are still triggering your modeling, because a lot of the forces that your bones experience just come from simply supporting your own weight, right? Just by the fact that we live on Earth and there's a gravitational field exposed to us, and we need our body to support itself, whether that be kind of standing up or even kind of laying down in bed, that just kind of naturally causes some forces and causes some remodeling to occur on its own. Right. But that alone is not enough. And so, you need to kind of exercise kind of beyond this. Right. Actually, a very kind of fascinating problem occurs, for people that go into space, right? So for astronauts that go to the International Space Station, what's unique about the space station? You don't experience gravity up there. Right? So one of the many kind of health issues that kind of occur for people that go to space is that their bones actually get weaker, and so their bones actually start to deteriorate at a much faster rate for people that actually spend time in space or long periods of time in space compared to the Earth. And so that's something that NASA is actually putting a lot of research into, is how to maintain bone health for these people that go up to space. And if we ever reach a point where people are kind of taking commercial trips to the moon or Mars and something like that, this is something that needs to be addressed, right? Because if you don't have strong bones, if you don't have good bone health, it's going to really dramatically affect your quality of life. Okay. So the opposite that can occur from this, right? So typically high intensity exercise is good, but you can actually push it a little bit too far as well. So I think, probably everyone in this class is a mechanical engineer. So I think probably everyone is familiar with the concept of fatigue, fatigue failure. And so, highly repeated, highly frequent kind of stress that's exposed to material can cause it to kind of break down and kind of fail at a much, lower force than kind of what you're used to. Bones are kind of the same way as well. Right. And so the medical term that's used for this is called hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is basically kind of a reduction in strength, just due to kind of a being exposed to stress is too much. And so probably something you've heard a lot is a stress fracture, which is kind of a consequence of this. Question, yes.
So I just found this kind of interesting, right? Because in the fitness industry in general, hypertrophy refers to a gain in strength and muscle, whereas atrophy would be the opposite of that. Is there not a term for atrophy in bones?
You were right. I skipped a page in my notes. You're absolutely right. So hypertrophy is an excessive growth. Excuse me. I'm talking about this kind of phenomenon of kind of overuse and fatigue is a stress fracture. But you're right. Hypertrophy is if you use it too much, then it can grow kind of outwards. Yeah. Thank you. So two separate things caused by my disorganization. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Hyper means bigger, so atrophy is the one that's where you lose strength. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about today is this condition called osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is a condition which is kind of characterized by a decreased amount of bone mass and bone strength. Okay? And it's typically a problem that occurs as people age. Okay. I think kind of what we're seeing kind of more often nowadays is kind of people living more and more kind of sedentary lifestyles. And so, people aren't triggering bone remodeling as much as they should. Okay. So osteoporosis, even though, people kind of associate it with kind of its symptoms. So people kind of get fractures or injuries more easily in old age. really it's kind of a condition that's kind of been building over long periods of time. Okay? And so if you were to chart this out, you know, as a function of time, okay? So a person's bone strength as a function of time, you know, the curve might look something like this. And so, you know, the bone strength will rise in the person's kind of adolescence. And so as they're kind of growing up, their early years, all through kind of their late teen years and their 20s, usually it reaches a peak somewhere in kind of your mid 20s. And then from there, it's kind of just literally all downhill. And so it kind of just decreases from there. Okay. And so typically, you know, when people kind of experience osteoporosis or usually when it's diagnosed, is usually somewhere kind of in this area right here, right? Usually, you know, they were doing something, you know, they get hurt, they go to the doctor performs an X-ray, and then they find out, yep, you have osteoporosis. Okay. But you know, this is not kind of and it's not inevitable for most people because you know not everyone has osteoporosis, although it's becoming more and more common. You know, because for some people, you know, if you let's say that you live a relatively active lifestyle, you're able to kind of trigger bone remodeling, you're able to kind of slow this descent pretty significantly. Okay? So for a relatively active person, you know, this curve may look something like this, right? And so if you're active in your youth, you know, you may be able to kind of grow kind of more bone strength like that. And then your decline will kind of be a lot less sharp. Okay. And so when you reach old age, you know, you'll have kind of more bone strength because you're able to kind of maintain your bone health all throughout your life. Okay. All right, but kind of the condition that you know that we kind of describe as osteoporosis is that decrease in bone strength in old age. Okay. And so if you were to kind of break this down into demographics, osteoporosis is a lot more common in women. Okay. And so if you look at the statistics, about 50% of women, once they reach old age, experience osteoporosis. But it's becoming more common in men. And so for men, it's about 34%. And so there's been a lot of theories as to why that it's more common in women. One of the kind of prevailing theories is that you know it's not that men are more active than women or anything like that. It's just that kind of you know during adolescence, men kind of stockpile much more calcium and much more bone strength than others. And so you know, and if you have kind of more kind of calcium kind of to begin with, even if you decay you know relatively rapidly, you just kind of have a bigger pile to start with. And so you know maybe you decline a bit more rapidly, but you know you still have a decent amount of bone strength so that you don't see any kind of fractures. Okay? Because osteoporosis is not something that's typically tested for kind of in a standard kind of medical test. Usually it's diagnosed after someone has an injury. So after someone gets fractured, they fall down, they hurt themselves. You know that's typically when a doctor prefers an X-ray. So you know it's you know it may be more prevalent than you know than we think, but you know that's only just because of how we test it. All right, any questions on this? Okay, all right, so that's all we got time for today. And so when we come back on Monday, we'll talk about muscles, and so we'll start talking about that. And then we'll move on to joints. All right, so thank you guys for coming today. Hope you guys had a good long weekend, and I will see you on Monday.
It's gonna be hot.
It'll be hot, yeah. So stay cool, everybody. Yeah, stay hydrated.
Yeah.
What's up? Good, how are you? So, office hours, it's okay. But, okay, and I also know that you teach FBA. Yeah. So I was wondering, I think, doing office hours for this class, will be very office hours, just so we can get some, we can analyze our Frank. Yeah, a lot of the questions and everything. Yeah, definitely, yeah, I mean, office hours are for that too. Yeah, drop by, come here, CAD, and we can talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, let me see. So I'm using two, so this one, I kind of flip flop kind of back and forth between them.
I'm taking a 490 class right now, and
Oh, nice.
it's with Robson.
Yeah.
She seems to be focused on biomechanics as well. So
Oh, awesome. Yeah, interest, there's a lot of interest in biomechanics nowadays. Yeah, so this is the one that I use. It's called Principles Biomechanics of Movement by Scott Dell. Yeah, it's on the syllabus too. So if you check the Canvas site for the syllabus, it's
I'm running the waitlist for the class.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah, so the author, if you look up the author, he's a pretty big guy in biomechanics, so it's Scott Dell. It's a very beautiful textbook, because he happens to be like one of his closest buddies growing up, like just happened to grow up being artists. And really he just paid his buddy to illustrate his book for him, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
So is there a good chance that I can get added to the class after you talk to the chair?
Yeah, so we're still working on that, unfortunately, so, yeah, I've sent him an email, yeah, about that. So, I remember, yeah, so I sent him an email already. I'm just kind of thinking about just a few things, but, yeah, I haven't heard back from him yet, so, but yeah, if it's gonna happen, probably this.
This week? Okay, sounds good. All right. Yeah. Thank you for all.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yep. Mhm.